Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks so much for coming. Louder or closer? Okay, how was that? Can everybody hear me? Good, I'm George Brown. I'm here only to do two things. One is to introduce a very exciting speaker. You all know John Ross. But before that, the other thing I have to do is, it's required, the PAC evacuation policy. When a fire alarm is activated, please remain in the PAC until the fire department and/or a representative from Woodland Pond has given you all clear or instructions to evacuate. Do not call the concierge desk. When evacuation is determined, the event facilitator will initiate the evacuation as follows. Please exit the room immediately using either of the two sets of double doors and immediately clear the hallway between the pool and PAC. First to evacuate should be any residents walking unassisted or with a cane. Then all residents who have a walker, wheelchair, or electric cart should evacuate last with assistance. Once the room is cleared, the facilitator of the meeting will shut both sets of double doors and report cleared status to the concierge. Amen. The reason I was invited to do this is that long ago and far away in 1964, John Ross and I attended a population workshop at the University of Chicago. We were bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, obviously, and thought that the world's population problem was something that we should be tackling. And here we are, how many years later, John? Where's John?
56.
There he is.
56.
56 years ago, India and other parts of Asia were the key problems because the birth rates were so high and the populations were so huge that many of us, and despite major efforts by the Indian government and by international agencies, India remained a huge problem. So John has now put together quite a remarkable presentation that demonstrates how things have changed dramatically in a positive way for India, not only in the fertility, but also in maternal health and child health, which after several years of focus primarily on family planning, the world became more aware of the very high rates of maternal mortality and morbidity and high rates of child death. And John will describe that as well, and then we'll be open for questions. And over to you, sir.
Okay. Turn that thing off. Okay. Just make sure I guess you want the lights up. Do we need the lights down?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's try it this way then. Let's try it that way. Okay, so we've flown already. We've left Woodland Pond, got off campus, and we're now in faraway India. I was told that if there's a faraway India, there must be another India, but we'll just go with the one that we've got and do the best. How many of you have been to India? Oh. How many of you have seen the Taj? Oh. Almost as many. Yeah, okay, well, we're got a big head start here. Let me see. India's crowded as we all know, and it has all these problems that we're all aware of. We sort of see India as some kind of a bumbling democracy that can't do anything quite right, and we hear about all the problems there and so on. However, there's good news, and that part of today will focus on the good news. Here's the good news, that India used to have, in traditional times, and even in 1984, 6 children, 6 births per woman, as an average, some more, some less. And it varied a lot by which of the provinces in India. And that has come down fairly regularly to 2. And that's really remarkable, given our image of India. It's the 2-child family. The typical woman has 2 births. We figure that by if a young woman age 15 were to go through the same age behavior as current women at different ages are doing, it would turn turn out to be two children, two births. So I want to look at the health side, and one extreme measure of women's health is deaths. Again, there's an amazing result, a lot of good news from India. That first number is about 104,000 maternal deaths per year at that time. That's the equivalent, as a colleague of ours pointed out, of an airliner crashing every single day with 250 women on board, all of whom died. That came down fairly regularly until it's now about 33,000. So it's a 3/4 decline. And that's really pretty historic. Page down. I said them already, yeah. Okay, what caused all that? There are what we call proximate determinants, the most immediate things. If you're a woman who's okay, wouldn't you like to have really good antenatal care? And wouldn't you then like to have good delivery care? And after that, wouldn't you like to have good postpartum care? That means you probably want doctors to be attending. So what we have is data on the percentage of cases where there's a doctor in attendance, as opposed to a granny midwife or just a nurse or whatever. And that gives you this chart here. The percentage of cases for antenatal care where a doctor was present, it's supposed to work, at the beginning, that's 2006. That's 2006, we only have data starting in 2006, so all this has occurred in a period of about 15 years. This is based upon national surveys that are done for the whole country. And they can, at the doorstep, they interview women about a whole variety, a whole range of topics, including what kind of care they had. So it was about half in 2006, and that's gone up by 15 points, which is about a 30% increase. Doctors attending the delivery has gone up from a third to about 2/5, and proportionally, that's also a very large change. And for postpartum care, is from about a third to about 3/4. Antenatal care generally was, nurse midwives are, the granny traditional midwives are sort of useless for antenatal care. They just kind of appear at the time of the delivery. But all this is, has been a set of 3 reasons as to why the number of maternal deaths has come down, down, down. This is the result. There are more doctors being there. It's one of the results, it's not the... And so the more mothers who have survived to raise their infants, and as I'll mention later, a much higher percentage of the infants survive as well, because the mother is healthier and other reasons that I'll come to. There are other reasons why the number of maternal deaths has come down, unrelated to the proximate determinants of the care that you actually get when you're pregnant. I want to talk about contraception in a little bit more detail. If women, instead of getting pregnant, use contraception, by and large, they don't get pregnant. If you don't get pregnant, you cannot die of a maternal death. So in terms of sheer numbers, there's a big cut in the number of maternal deaths that occur, that actually do occur, which otherwise would, try that again. So anyway, more women using contraception means fewer maternal deaths. But apart from that, it's a question of the mix of who uses contraception. Who is it who went for contraception, who in the old days might not have? Above them and beyond almost anything else is women who don't want another birth. We've got 4 already, they want to stop. And there's been a disappearance of 5th order births, 6th order births, and higher births. They just don't happen as much. They've gone out of fashion. So the woman who's got 2 now wants to stop, in many cases, at 3. Wants to stop at 2 and not have the 3rd one. If she's got 3, she wants to stop and not have the 4th one. Those are high-risk births that are being avoided, being prevented. The risk of having some complication, not necessarily death, but some maternal morbidity and so on, is higher for the higher order births. And those women are also older, and the risks are higher for older women. So this selectivity in who goes to contraception is another reason why the number of maternal deaths goes down. Okay, that's part of the good news. Another reason why there are fewer deaths is that you don't have as many young women getting pregnant, where the risk is higher. They're postponing marriage in India. Traditionally, a lot of women were married before age 15. And if you track that, I had to select just one, but if you track that, it's been fairly low and gone down even more drastically than this one. And the percentage who still do marry before age 18 is about, to the right, about 22%, about 1/5. And if you had this for age 20, a much higher percentage have married, but that has been coming down as well. This sort of dynamic operates in 2 different ways. If there's a historic period when women are postponing marriages, right, it means that in this calendar year, you don't have as many marriages as you would have had. And with the delay, you don't have as many first births in that calendar year, a year later. So that's a transition thing. Now, when it stabilizes later at the new age, let's say instead of 20, it's 22, it's as though you didn't have any marriages for 2 years. And that effect has occurred over a period of some years. So then it stabilizes at a new average age, which lengthens the generation. Generation is longer. The number of births that they're having is spread out more thinly, so you have fewer each year, and that's a permanent effect of later marriage. The result, this is repeating a little bit, is that in 1993, the number of births was about 3.4 average. It's come down to 2. 14 on 3/4, that's it's a substantial percentage decline. Sorry, I just mean that if the fall is 1.4, correct? 1.4 based on the original 3.4 is a high percentage, that's all. Now, a new topic, in a way, is that all this information comes from women being interviewed at the doorstep by another woman. And usually there's a person who's helping them find the particular house and so on. Women are very happy to talk about to other women about, how many children do they have and how many do they want, and they're 2 boys and 1 girl, and are they using anything to avoid pregnancy if they want to, and it goes on and on. They're also willing to say whether or not their most recent birth was bad timing, or was it just not wanted at all. So you get these percentages, and in one country after another, a substantial percentage of women will say that the last birth really wasn't well timed or it just wasn't wanted at all. Now, many of those are high parity births, and many of them are births that came too close together that they didn't want, at least at that time. So this percentage has fallen, as you see, quite a lot. It's down to about 1 in 12 now. This goes back again to who's using contraception. The reason that a lot of these births are being avoided and that this percentage has come down is that the ones who previously would have not used contraception and gotten pregnant did not do so. I might just intersperse, I was told to try to not have statistics only, but to try to say something about what this work that George and I were involved in over all these years. The stories that we end up with are quite varied. I remember in Korea going out to observe an interviewing team under a full moon, walking through the rice paddies there, and we arrive, and here they all around checking their questionnaires. And the head man wants to entertain us, brings out this thing of rice wine, which we have to drink, and interrupted all the work of the survey. There was a survey in northern Brazil. A program had been created there to make the pill available to local women. They could either receive it at the doorstep or they could come to a place that was created in a village. One woman came running into the headquarters saying, please don't come to my door to interview. My husband will kill me if he finds out I'm taking the pill. There were others like that. Then there was a survey team who came back all wet because in order to get to the site where they were to interview people, they had to wade through the stream and had the questionnaires on their heads, and so on and so forth. Well, stories can go on. George has a lot of stories as well. It's a strange field. The family that I grew up in, there were certain words that were never heard. I never heard the term contraception in my growing up. I never heard sex. I never heard pill, except for not contraceptive. So then I went into this general field, and people back home were saying, well, what is it you do? And we didn't have any ready answer. I mean, how could I tell my mother what I wanted to do? So anyway, we kind of had a lot of euphemisms. To return to the statistics, infant mortality rates have also declined by a lot, and are down now to, this is about 2.5% of infants die. This is 25 out of 1,000. Now, it's come down a lot, but it's still way, way above what some other developing countries have done and what the U.S. figure would be. Why? Again, the selectivity in which births occur. The births that do occur now are healthier births because the women who go on to contraception are those who are avoiding the higher risk births. In New York State, when abortion became legal, a lot of pregnancies were avoided that otherwise would have produced high-risk infants. And the actual infant mortality rate in New York State went down after abortions were legalized. Question?
Does that mean that 83.5% of births for the infant died?
No, it means 8%, 8.3. This is per thousand.
Oh, okay.
So
it's a number per
I have to
thousand.
convert to percentage.
Thank
So
you.
at the right is a little bit below 3% of the infants are dying now as of the last survey. Okay. By way of a little summary of what I've been going through before, if you think of Mrs. Tron, she's age 15, and what is she going to be doing? Compared to the past, she'll do several things that are healthy and reduce the chance of dying in childbirth. She waits longer to get married. She waits longer to have the first birth. She waits longer between births, so they don't come too close together, and then one doesn't get breastfed as well as the other or whatever. And then she waits longer before the next birth. Overall, she has fewer children, and the result is that fewer die, if any. As a side note, before China had the one-child family, it had something called later, longer, fewer. And that also reduced the birth rate quite a bit in China because it was encouraged a lot with public education and all. It meant that she marries later, she waits longer before the next births, she has fewer births overall, later, longer, fewer. And if they stuck with that, it would have been more humane, not as drastic as the one-child family, which wasn't really probably needed that much since the previous one was working. But we'll come to China in just a minute. So, good news. Replacement fertility has arrived. Maternal deaths are down. Services during pregnancy have improved a lot. Unwanted births have declined. Contraceptive use is up. Young women are postponing marriage. Infant mortality is down. Maternal mortality is down too, but it's still a lot higher than in developed countries, way higher. Developing countries in general can almost be identified and filtered out by their maternal mortality rates, because they're all in a range that is still way above the range for the West and the U.S. There's just a difference in kind there. So many maternal deaths come about as emergencies. And in rural Indiana, you don't have transport immediately. If you go to the clinic, there may not be any doctor there, or he's not even. And so the proportion of maternal deaths in developing countries that come from emergencies often end in death. So anyway, at the bottom, we'll shift here to some of the bad news. Go back. Yeah, I wanted to mention that The Godfather, wanted bad news immediately, but I postponed that till we could come through the good news first. So let's trace what's happened. This is 2000 at the left, and this is 2050 at the right, so we have the projection. If we trace the India line, in 22 years ago, it was something above 1 billion population. It was growing rapidly, and it's now, as of next year, I think it is, the UN is projecting that it will overtake China. And it will continue to grow. So that by 2050, it'll be up at about 1.7 billion. So the difference of about 300 million is equal to 2 Bangladeshs next door.
What?
The country of Bangladesh is about half that. So this is equivalent to 2 of those in terms of adding to the planet's population.
Or to the United States.
It's the same as in the U.S. You're a great straight person here. Now, why is that? When we've got each woman having only 2 children, because there's so many women. There's a bulge in the childbearing age group. And so each one has 2 children, but there's so many women, so you have a huge number of births every year, much more than the number of deaths, because India is not an old population yet. It's called momentum. It's built in population growth. And the fact that momentum can be responsible for about 1/3 of a country's population growth, even though the average family size is small. What happened in China is the reverse. It was growing too. It started coming down because of all the past reductions in birth rates, meant that it was eating into the size of the childbearing age group a generation later. So you didn't have as many childbearing age women later after the fertility declined a great deal and sharply earlier. It's called the echo effect. So China, instead of having 2 births per woman, is down about I forgot the exact term, it's 1.5 or 1.2, it's very low. Yeah. So you don't have many births per woman, and in addition, you have fewer women here. You don't have the bulge in that age group. So the projection for China is that it's going to decline in total population by a fair amount. All right?
But isn't China has done away with the one-child policy? They're now encouraging women, I believe what I've read, they're encouraging women now to have at least 2. What is that going to do to that curve?
Very little, probably, because most of them are not paying attention. There's so much in the cities now. The living standards are so much higher. The cost of educating a child is so much more. That all the interviews and all the surveys since then indicate that, yeah, well, you know, they're gonna, each couple is gonna have the number they want, not the number for the motherland, you know. So the projection is what you see here, because the UN is, these are all UN projections, and they're taking into account some of the surveys that go on. So that's the projection. China should be losing population, but of course, as you read in the newspapers, where they really get hit is in the labor force size. And that's true in the West, and it's true throughout Europe. Every single country in Europe is below replacement fertility. And if you look at their population pyramids, they're squeezed down at the bottom. There are not many children aged 0 to 4, 5 to 9 coming up. So it means that countries like Japan have to think seriously about whether or not to have immigration and what to do about it all. So that's what we just said. Each year, India is adding about 22 million infants with all the needs that they have for food, and medical care, and housing. And there'll be another 22 million next year, and the next year, and the next year. And in terms of the labor force, the question is, are they well educated? Because the numbers are going to be large. There'll be about 26 million young people who will reach age 20 and need, that's about the size of Texas, yeah, who have all these needs, and they're moving into the cities and so on. City growth. This is New Delhi growing over the 25 years between 1974 and 1999. And if you had a third slice for where it is now, it would be probably double what you see here. Now, this is, true of most of the cities of India, and of course, countries around it as well. Urban growth is just fairly universal. What it does is to drain off the excess from the rural high birth rates. So, as a generalization, rural populations are staying about constant in the developing world. Oh, well, part of the city, I didn't know about it. One of the family businesses that grows up with all the poverty in the cities is harvesting the garbage piles. So this is an example of crowded housing. And I thought that maybe the contrast would be interesting. This is New Paltz.
Is that really a pond?
It's a pond, but so these women wrote together at a family planning clinic. It was open to everyone, but only 2 men showed up. But these are not the only women in India. The numbers are smaller, but I thought that would get more of a reaction. So, okay, to wrap up, good news is that there has been this reproductive revolution in terms of services and in terms of the selectivity in which women now get pregnant. It's a much lower risk across the board. And so instead of spending most of their lives being pregnant or taking care of children and homemaking, they now have much more personal freedom to work, have their own income, and have wanted children. So let me leave it on that note, and are there more questions?
Thank you, Doc. Thank you, John, for that's amazing. One personal note, when I told my relatives what I was doing, I didn't tell them I was actually passing out pills and urging condoms. It was the country in question, their government, and the large NGOs, local people who were doing the work. We were just there to applaud them and help them technically when required, so it wasn't quite as hands-on as you sort of hinted at there. Do we have any questions? Oh my God. Oh, okay.
I don't think I missed this. To what do you attribute all this?
I didn't mention the family planning program.
No, you didn't.
You're very gracious. Most of these countries have established national programs to encourage the use of contraception, to encourage later marriage. And so what George and I did was to work on the technical side and some kind of support for these national programs. So they deployed contraceptive methods. Depending on the country, there's a lot of selectivity on what methods they'll encourage. The drawback in India has been that it's been primarily female sterilization. So a lot of younger women, female sterilization. So a lot of younger women aren't ready for that yet. But India has not done very much at all with the IUD or the pill or the injectable. So that 67% who are using method would be higher if women had more of a choice there. Yeah.
Who's next? Here's one over here. I'll get to the other side first.
I was wondering how much education of women is a factor. I mean, that's been my understanding, that this is very important. Women wanting an education, wanting to have a profession, or just to get educated for many reasons.
There are a number of background factors, not the proximate ones, but the background factors. Education I didn't show, but education has been moving up rapidly in India. Much higher percentage finish high school for women. And you also have, in terms of the number of children who are wanted, there's an interaction with, because the longer they go in school, the more secular they become. They're moving into cities, and the ideal family size goes down as well.
I have a question in the over corner here. This fellow has his hand up. A lot.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that usually, populations have a larger number of kids, besides the religion and so on, is if they live in the countryside, having children is part of the economic engine,
Exactly.
because they need more people to work in the fields and so on and so forth. And so that has, in the migration to the cities, I mean, puts a real lot of pressure to, production of foods and so on. That's one thing.
You have a question?
Huh?
What's your question?
Yeah, well, it's a remark. I mean, I don't know if you want to address it. But the other one is related to the population, the decreasing population in Europe and so on, that they are below the reproduction, the needed reproduction to maintain these things. These pictures basically, how much of those pictures address the fact that there are migrations? Obviously, migration between India and China is not a very practical thing. But in many other countries which are not as big, migration is an important factor.
Yeah, you can select individual cases, sure. But by and large, for India, a lot of people leave. But as a percentage of the sending population, it's negligible. Yeah.
Migration is a huge issue, and so is education.
You mentioned that infant mortality is still quite large. Are there any plans to work on that, or what are the causes of infant mortality that still seems to be larger than what would be desirable?
Right. One of the great success stories internationally throughout the developing world has been this amazing decline in infant mortality rates. It's even true in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not only the risk, the annual rate, but the absolute numbers have come down. I mean, there are more births all the time, so you expect more deaths, but you don't. So part of this is due to, for the last 30 or 40 decades, very strong immunization campaigns. The Catholic Church has helped us a lot in Sorry, I was resting on the computer. Try that. So a high percentage of infants now are immunized. And environmental conditions, fresh water, safe water, and so on. But in any case, it's a great victory. Now, the causes, if infant mortality, it's also true of child mortality before age 5. Below age 1, you separate it into the first month, which is more biological causes. And those are not so amenable to public health. So as a proportion, they remain higher. So infant mortality is less responsive in a way than child mortality. It's a long answer to that.
Yes.
Someone else was going first.
Get back here.
I'm here for my questions. A couple of questions. What about the makeup of the overall population, women versus men?
Well, half and half in general, but the older the group, the more women, of course. Yeah.
Okay, next question that I have is, you always linked births and marriage. Is there any other measurements? Are there unwed marriages or children born to unwed mothers? And are they part of this study?
Very much so. A lot of the surveys interview all women regardless of their marital status. So they get a fix on, and mother really, I didn't have room to go into the other group. But single women who are sexually active, and their definitions for sexually active, behavior in the last month or 6 months or whatever, use contraception at a higher percentage than married women do. Married women, a lot of them are using contraception because they're older and so on, or they want another child. But most of the single sexual active ones don't want to get pregnant. So that's a generalization in many countries, including sub-Saharan Africa. Some countries don't want you to interview single women. So that's been a limitation in India and some of the other conservative Muslim countries.
John, most of your statistics, of course, are retrospective. It's very difficult, of course, to make projections, although you've shown a few projections there. I wonder if you or any of your erstwhile colleagues in the profession have started to plug in the consequences of climate change and the vast number of heavily populated oceanfront properties. I'm talking about New York City, LA, most of India, the big ones in India, and so on and so forth. What the effect of a rise of 6 feet in sea level as a result of climate change might do to all of these lovely projections.
Well, birth rates tend to go down when there's any kind of a disaster. I mean, people will cite when New York State lost all of its electricity, the birth rate went up 9 months later. But no, if there's a terrible disaster where you lose half of Miami, then it's going to disrupt everything, including marriage and reproductive behavior of all types. I don't know how much. I don't remember any literature that's tried to quantify any of that. But the worse climate change is, the lower birth rates will be, but probably and the higher death rates will be. So we can expect that kind of change.
Is there a social security system in India where the parents are taken care of by the government or paid like a retirement fund? Because one of the reasons for having large families, a lot of kids, is that they look after you when you get older. And that's one motivating factors for that. And if the money or support can come from the government, then that kind of negates the need for a big family.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Jakob was indicating, the need for children is a whole lot less in the cities, and that's where they're going. You know, housing is scarce, they don't need children for all the agricultural work, and so on. So I don't know if that speaks to your question, but this rapid change is so, permeates so much through the country. Ryan Sue?
Were these surveys done across the socioeconomic fabric of the country? Were untouchables interviewed as much as upper class Brahmin? And were the surveys also distributed in Hindu and Muslim communities equally?
Yes, the surveys, all these national surveys, and in my computer I've got 200 of these surveys that have been done over the years, and they've all been done pretty much through a common questionnaire. There's been a lot of international coordination and so on. So they are representative of the entire population. So you can do tabulations by religion, by education, by income, and do all the contrasts. And one of the interesting things is the quintile. You separate the population into 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, so you have 5 groups. According to the household wealth, you get huge differentials. Much more contraceptive use as you go to the higher wealthy group. Much more urban residents, much higher education, lower, smaller, ideal family size. It's just very sharp. As you come down to the bottom one, that's more rural, and so their behavior is correspondingly quite different. But they are representative. I can sit on my computer and tell you what women who are aged 30 to 34 living in rural areas of India wanted for lunch almost. It's a wonderful, in the entire world of public health, there's nothing like this in the population field, family planning field.
I don't know how to phrase my question. What about the whole world and sustainability and the ability to feed the population? I mean, where should we go and how do we advise? How should we control the population so that the whole world doesn't starve?
Well, there are 2 questions, yeah. In terms of prospects, I'm sorry, the prospects are dismal. There's no way to sugarcoat this. The prospects are dismal. You saw the chart for India. If you saw the chart for Sub-Saharan Africa, it's worse. Pakistan is next door, it's a smaller country, and you have these 2 nuclear powers that are always at each other's throat. So total population growth is going to be going up, up, up. Europe is the other way. You've got 2 different worlds. And what you're reading in the New York Times, that the population problem is over, and they're talking about Europe, is all wrong. So that's one thing. The starvation thing, there'll be increasing pressures on food delivery systems, the kinds of food, and there's all the efforts always underway to find a more efficient, another green revolution, and there's going to be some of that too. But I'm with Paul, who promised to be a pessimist on all this. And so there it is.
Could I just add to that? But these concerns about the sustainability are real, but the population component of it has largely been either neglected or downplayed until recently. Now it's becoming more concerned, but people in the climate crisis business are generally not too willing to get into this area because it touches too close to home. Telling women how many children they have is not a productive thing to do. And how to do something about that increase in India, because the women are already born, they're coming into childbearing age now. There's nothing to be done. They're going to have those children, whereas China is going the opposite direction. The good news is China is going in the opposite direction. And the world is growing more slowly than it was when you and I began working, John. Is that correct?
We never thought we would solve the whole problem, but
Well, we thought we might, but neither of us worked in India, so we can't take any credit for this. Any last questions? Oh my God, we're out of questions. I wanted to add also to the comment about education. I think around the world, education's just gone up and up and up, and it's a huge, huge factor in causing decreasing in maternal and child mortality, increasing well-being, and decreasing fertility. Here's one more question. You get the last one. How's that?
I'm thinking about zero population growth. How is that factored into this, or how has that affected world population? Or at one time I thought zero population growth was a great idea.
Well, there's still organizations that are hard at work and pushing that as an ideal and trying to find ways to get there and so on. We don't hear about it a lot here, but they're out there, and I get regular publications. And the ZBG, and still that organization is still very active in Washington. There's a great deal on the web, for if you go to the ZBG there. I'll make an exception for.
The one thing I'd like to add to this is that there was a very significant change in the approach to this work that happened many decades ago. I can't remember, maybe in the 90s, I think, in which the approach to the whole field radically changed from an emphasis on reducing the size of the population to women's rights, to reproductive freedom and choice. And I think that has sort of turned the field around. So it's not people don't like to talk in the field at all about reducing the population, because that implies you're imposing something on women, but rather encouraging women to understand how much it can add to the value of their lives.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very, very much.